What's up, everybody? Welcome back to your favorite New York Jets subscription podcast, Badlands. I'm your host, Joe Caporoso, joined by Paul Kilgallen. The New York Jets quit and died today against the Arizona Cardinals, losing 31-6 in one of the more pathetic efforts we've seen in a long time. Post-game therapy, I'll call it more post-game ranting about this corpse of a season. We're going to get it off our chest right now because I didn't want to wait any longer to record and yell. I'm not going to do another version of this with Connor post SNY show and all throughout the week. But holy shit, this was embarrassing. And Paul, I'll let you open, and then I'm just going to get it all off my chest after. A game that ended the second it started. What are your initial thoughts on this one?
Yeah, I think everybody needs to hear the ranting at this point. My first thought is that the tackling camp that they ran for Pee Wee football this week did not work. Right? They were arguably worse at tackling in this game than they have been most of the season, and that they've already been bad. So came out completely lifeless. I think as soon as the opening drive happened, Cardinals put up 7. We go down the field, stall at the goal line again, put up 3. And right at that point, I had a bad feeling that we were about to get boat raced. And, that being boat raced actually would have been an improvement over what actually happened. They just got their absolute doors blown off. They looked dead. It looked like the defense quit again. I feel like we say that almost every week where you can visibly see them quitting, but it happened again. And yeah, I mean, we had a 1 week respite from, the doom and gloom where it was a couple things broke our way in the NFL. We won a game. All of a sudden the window opens again, but we're right back to I don't see any other solution other than completely tearing this entire thing down. I'm developing strong hatred for this team. You guys talk about the 2016 team all the time as being just a completely unlikable group of absolute saps, and that's how I'm starting to feel about this team. It's a bunch of dogs. I hate watching them every week. I still will, but this is absolutely painful to watch every single week.
Yeah, I think that summarizes it well. And I always get, especially during these games, the unlikable question. Is this the most unlikable Jets team that you've ever seen? I can't stand watching these guys. They're hard to root for. And I hate that I have to keep coming back to them being, or Dion Dawkins and everything he said about them being right about them in many ways. And if you don't recall, the quotes were effectively the Jets are a bunch of fake tough guys. They're playing for Instagram. They're not playing for actually trying to win football games. And it seemed a little over the top and egregious at the time. But then you watch a game like this, and as you said, the windows are opening up, right? The Broncos lose in sort of miraculous fashion. The Colts lose. It looks Bengals lost on Thursday. It does look very much like an 8-9 or 9-8 team is going to get in. And you're looking at the schedule and you're saying, can they find a way to do this? And I didn't pick the Jets to beat the Cardinals. I think like many Jet fans, I hate them in this spot. I hate them flying west against a physical run-heavy team. I did not think they were going to win, but I thought they were going to show up. And I thought they were going to put up points. And I thought they would compete a little bit. They didn't compete at all in this game. Arizona did not have to punt in this game in any meaningful moment. They scored on the first 4 drives of the game. They got the ball. The game was over at halftime. Yes, the Jets moved the ball a little bit, but if you can't score touchdowns, nobody cares. And if Devontae Adams can't make plays in the red zone, then why did you trade for him? And if Aaron Rodgers can't make plays in the red zone, then why did you trade for him? He's check down, speed out, slant, check down. And then you get down there with Breece Hall, and he gets you down the field, and he doesn't get touches. It's almost like when they get in the red zone, it's well, how do we get Aaron another touchdown pass? How about just give the ball to your best offensive players, who's Breece Hall or Garrett Wilson, and twice they get down there on second down and they just throw the ball and you end up settling for field goals. That's not the story of this game. The story of this game is the defense. And this game ended officially, and this season and this game was embodied by, they call the right play on third down. They have Trey McBride wrapped up 5 yards short of the marker by Sauce Gardner, who's supposed to be an all-pro. And McBride keeps fighting, and Sauce doesn't have the energy or effort to hold on long enough to get help or to pull the guy down, breaks a tackle, runs for the first down. It's game over right there. And it's everything we've been talking about and complaining about with Sauce all the way on down to the rest of the defense. If he's supposed to be the best player on your defense and he plays like that, everyone else feels it. And nobody else tackles on this team. Nobody else has any interest in tackling. Even when they do things right, like Quincy Williams, who I do really love, and I do feel like he's one of the guys who plays with the right energy, blows up Kyler. And instead of, maybe like trying to get the ball, he's running 40 yards in the other direction to celebrate, where there might have been a fumble to be had there. And I don't want to be the old man on the yard, like, yelling and get off my lawn. Like, this team they're too busy streaming and golfing and they don't care. But man, it's hard to watch this defense in particular. They've been so soft since week one. And that Cardinals team on paper is certainly no more talented than them. And I don't want us to overdo it on the Jets are loaded with talent. Their defensive line is pathetic. And the fact that they have not adjusted the Clemens and Kinlaw situation, especially with Clemens, we've been talking about it for so long, that's on the front office. That's on the coaching staff. It's ridiculous they continue to trot Clemens and Tony Adams and Kinlaw. These guys are not NFL starters. Clemens will not be on an NFL roster next year. If he is not in the Jets, he will not be on an NFL roster next year. It will not happen. That's how bad he is. And teams go directly at him, and they just run the ball up and down the field in the Jets. And when your defense is just manhandled like that, it evaporates everything else. I'm not giving Aaron Rodgers a pass, who stunk today. I'm not giving Devontae Adams a pass, who stunk today. But you don't have a chance when you know that the other offense could run the ball up and down the field of you. The Cardinals were getting 5, 8, 12, 15 yards per play. The Jets had no interest in being there. This is a soft, overrated, overhyped defensive unit, and it goes all the way from the top down. You listen to their lame duck shell company 8-minute media appearance from their head of football operations and their GM, who has a worse record than Mike McCagnon, a worse record than John Edsick, and got more time than both of them combined. I serve at the behest of the owner, could not want to be here at all. And it completely comes through, and that goes all the way down to the coaching staff, who is not prepared and is overmatched every week, goes down to their top players like Sauce, who can't do the fundamentals, and it goes down to just about every part of this roster outside of like 5 or 6 players. And that's how you get completely boat raced by a pretty good team, but not a great team, a team that's just hungrier and cares more and is running all over the field. And this is the 2016 Redux. This team is every bit as unlikable as that team. And there is nothing to do except blow up what parts of you can. Because, look, they're going to have some phantom moments and wins the rest of the year, like they did in the second half against the Texans. Like, the Colts are kind of like a zombie at this point. The Jaguars are a zombie. They're going to have some moments where you're like, oh, that's kind of what it could have been. At the end of the day, when push comes to shove and this regime really needs to win a game, think back to the Seattle game in 2022. Think back to the Dolphins game last year. They cannot compete. And it was just absolutely pathetic. And what makes it like more pathetic is that so many of us like saw this loss coming. I think a lot of people saw a blowout coming. I thought they could be a little competitive, but I was wrong. I mean, they didn't belong on the same field as them today. It's hard for me to think of a less likable team. 2016 is what comes to mind for me. Parts of 2012. What is going on with the energy around this team? I've never seen anything like it.
That's kind of like what I wanted to get into next, was like there's something unquantifiable from a person standpoint, a person and people standpoint going on with the defense, because you can't tell me that this drop off in defense from last year to this year, with all that they survived trying to hold teams under 10 points with Zach Wilson running the offense on the other side, and like how many games they kept the Jets in that the Jets had no business being in. You can't tell me that this is all because of Bryce Huff and Quentin Jefferson and Al Woods being gone in the middle. Like, you can't. I'm sorry. I can't go with that. Like, there's something else going on. There's another level to it. You mentioned the Joe D press conference. I mean, that thing played like it was a scene out of like The Office or Best in Show or like one of those like ridiculous, absurd movies or TV shows. Like, I could not believe what I was watching and the responses that he was giving in that thing. And like, it just goes to show that everything you've been saying for the last month and a half is right. Like, the guy is not working. There is nobody that's actually doing anything there. I don't know how they managed to swing a trade for Devontae Adams and like get the Hassan Reddick deal done when like it took 6 weeks to even interview some other kickers, and you couldn't even really cut Zerline at that point. You had to send him to IR. It all comes from the top on down, but there is something unquantifiable happening. And I hate to bring up the culture word, but like there's something that you can't specifically point to any one person or blame anybody for, which makes it even more frustrating because you really need somebody to blame. You need somebody to direct the vitriol at, but it really is just everybody. And it is all coming from the top down, where you know, they just quit over and over and over again, and I'm so tired of hearing from the quarterback. I'm sorry, I'm tired of hearing from the. I know it's not all his fault. I'm tired of from hearing from the quarterback on Tuesday of every week of just like, just relax. We need to win in a few in a row. Like, no, it's not like that anymore. At some point, this team has to own who they are and stop saying this isn't who they are, and they have to start making some meaningful changes. And I don't know what that looks like. I don't know if that's benching people or cutting people or making some moves, but like something meaningful has to change and the tone around the team has to change, and it's just not happening. It's the same drivel over and over again. It's the same product on the field week after week, year after year, and then it's the same shovel of shit into our ears all week, every week of, hey, we just got to get a couple things corrected. We're not that far off. We've been hearing it for years, and I cannot hear it anymore. The team is completely gutless. It's painful to watch. Nothing meaningful has changed since they fired the head coach. Nothing. There has not been a bump in performance. There has not been a change in rhetoric. There's not been a change in tone. There hasn't been a change on the field. Nothing. Absolutely nothing has changed. If anything, they seem to have gotten a little worse. The penalties are worse. The mistakes are worse. The drops are worse. Devontae Adams comes in here. He dropped, 5 passes today? Garrett Wilson was completely uninvolved. At one point during the game, I Googled, is Tyler Conklin playing today? Because I know he's been a little banged up and he was just completely invisible. I can't understand how the product could continue to be this bad. It's really mind blowing. I mean, what do you think is responsible for that?
Uh, it's such a complicated thing, and it's why I like. I mean, we could start doing this a little bit now, especially with the bye week upcoming, and start getting ahead of the real autopsy of this entire Douglas era and regime, and every little thing that's broken in the football side of the business, and how the infrastructure works, and how certain parts have just rotted out, and they've tried to paper over it. At the core, I don't know when it happened. It probably happened a few years ago when they forced Saleh to fire LaFleur, and everything started to get a little into the half measure, different timeline situation that always kills regimes. So you could say what you will. Douglas and Saleh kind of came in lockstep. Douglas hired Saleh, and there was a moment there where it looked like they were turning the corner in 2022. Then Zach got too bad. Mike White got hurt. The bottom fell out, and I don't think there was an agreement within the organization about what to do about the offense. They fire LaFleur. You end up with Hackett. Do they still get Rodgers with Hackett? Then you get Saleh adamant about keeping guys like Downing and Keith Carter. And then you look at the regression of certain players in the offensive line. And these little things just sort of all start stacking up. And now does Douglas start to check out a little bit because he doesn't feel like he has control? Is he not getting what he wants? He's making weird comments about Saleh. We get the Athletic article where it kind of feels like they should have fired Saleh before this season. And I don't think anyone thought he was going to be a good coach or turn anything around. And I understand, like you could say, well, they've just been worse since they fired him. Like, okay, maybe they'd be a game better with him. At the end of the day, his record speaks for itself. Ulbricht's record's unfortunately going to speak for itself. They need a new head coach. They're going to need a new head coach no matter what. They need a new GM. They need a new GM no matter what. But all the timelines and all the energy feels off. It feels like what is left of the front office has no working relationship with what is left of the coaching staff. It's like the leftovers where like a bunch of people disappeared and they never actually filled the roles. They just kind of shuffled around admin people internally to like fill it. And I think the default answer was always like Rodgers will fix it, Rodgers will fix it, Rodgers will fix it. And Rodgers is just like okay at this stage. He has some moments where he looks good, and today's not on him because nobody was winning this game today with how the defense was, but he doesn't have it in him anymore to go out and throw for 340 yards in a game like this and like carry them over the top and rally the sideline. He seems isolated. I don't know if there's a clique around him and the rest of the team really isn't gravitating towards him. I do wonder if there's some type of like generational divide on this team with like the Rodgers clique and the guys who were sort of the young core before him. That's probably overanalyzing all this stuff. It's just a bad team, right? They have talent. They don't have as much talent as most people think that they do because you see the big names, but unless you're close to this team, you don't realize that they usually start Michael Clemens, Javon Kinlaw, and Solomon Thomas, and all those guys suck. And they start Tony Adams and Ashton Davis, and they suck. And they play Tyler Conklin and Jeremy Ruckert, and they're not that good. They should have drafted Trey McBride, who every Jet fan in the world I know wanted to draft. And I don't bring that up often, but literally Connor on down to everyone on Jets Twitter was like, draft Trey McBride. Nope, Jets knew better. They didn't. And that guy is unstoppable. And you look at modern NFL offenses, they have a tight end like that. Conklin's fine. He's not a bad football player. He is not a dynamic playmaker. Ruckert is Ben Hartsock. You don't have enough on offense to compete. And when you have guys like Brees and Garrett, they're not getting featured enough. Brees should have got 25 carries today. He was ripping off 7-8 yards a carry, 10 carries for 52 yards. He can't get any carries in the red zone. And Garrett caught every ball thrown to him, but we're so busy trying to force feed the ball to Devontae Adams that he's not getting the looks down the field that he needs either. And then you're at the point where you had no need for Mike Williams, who had a ridiculous game-winning touchdown today for Pittsburgh, so you could play Irv Charles and Corley and Gibson, and you're throwing third down dig routes to 5'1" Xavier Gibson. And you're lucky you got mowed over and they called a penalty and wiped your interception off the board. It's just full mismanagement, and I think there's a malaise and the mope that sets in with this team. Once something goes wrong, everyone quits and everyone turtles. They're a bandwagon team. If things are going well, everyone's excited, everyone's celebrating, everyone's "I told you so." If one thing goes bad, they have the ultimate loser and quitter mentality. And that was Sauce getting ragdolled by Trey McBride. Defense quit after that. Oh, here's Sauce again, not tackling. And he's going to go on the podcast this week and tell Richard Sherman he's being treated unfairly because he can't tackle and people are calling him on it. Trickles down to everybody else. And nobody else tackles in the secondary because their best player doesn't tackle. And nobody in the defensive line has any integrity because their main edge rusher, they got a huge standoff with him when they traded for him. They added him late. He's just trying to get a contract. He doesn't care about rush integrity. He's trying to rack up a couple sacks and get the hell out of here. And everybody else is a mess and hanging each other out to dry. And then it's a shame. It is a shame that fans have to deal with this and watch such an unlikable, lackadaisical product. Anyone could watch. We've watched bad teams. Like the 2017 Jets were bad, but they fought and they were competitive and it looked like they cared. They had some really ugly games, but they would punch above their weight most weeks. The 2013 Jets would alternate every week between winning and getting blown out, but they would punch above their weight and they were not ridiculously unlikable. This team in this year's version of the AFC should win 9 games, and they're probably going to win 5 or 6 games because of everything I just said. And to have this game where to have a game where you have a chance to build a little momentum and to just not compete from the opening snap. And like this game was over from the opening drive. There was never even an illusion of this being a competitive game. It's just shocking, especially off 10 days of rest and talking about tackling practice at camp. You hear things coming out of this team that you just don't hear from other teams. And they're going to continue to be bipolar and inconsistent and dumb and have different games where you see a glimpse of it like you did in the second half against Houston. But when push comes to shove and they're playing a real team, they're going to get their ass kicked because they're soft and they have no idea how to win, unfortunately. Rodgers and Devontae did a long time ago. I don't know if they know how to do it in today's NFL. Game might have passed them by to an extent, and those are bigger, harder questions we'll talk about in the offseason. We'll rip through some of the Q&As we got in the Discord. We're going to save some for War Room this week. But any other general thoughts before we start ripping through some of these questions?
No, I think, that's the most frustrating part to me is that it's not going to completely bottom out. They're not going to lose every game the rest of the season. We are still going to occasionally see the things that we thought we were going to see on a more consistent basis, and they're going to end up somewhere in the middle of the first round. And that's what's going to make this even more painful and frustrating. The other thing I'll say is you could add Isaiah Likely onto that pile of tight ends that we all wanted that might have been in the same draft even as Trey McBride. No, we were too good for that. We didn't need that. I'll try to add a little bit of levity here. Like my wife invited a couple other families over to watch the 1:00 game specifically today because the Giants were playing in the morning, the Jets were playing at 4. So, let's use the 1:00 games to socialize a little bit. And one of the families stayed a little bit longer than I would have preferred because, like me, I know you're the same way. We don't like to have people around while we're watching the Jets. And when Trey McBride broke that tackle on Sauce Gardner, I lost my mind. And the guy who was here, who was a Giants fan, was like, well, Trey McBride's like twice his size. And my head almost exploded. I was like, no, it wouldn't have mattered if that was Deuce Vaughn. Like, Sauce was just not making that tackle. He was never going to make that tackle. And so, yeah, I mean, it's just, I don't know if I could say anything more to what you said. I will kind of ask a question before we get into these Q&As going along the timeline thing. Convince me why Aaron Rodgers can play another year here if there is going to be a new head coach and a new GM. If we're going to try to do the right thing and get on the right timelines, like why on earth? And I know it's not totally in the team's control. Like at the end of the day, it's kind of up to Rodgers because there is another year on his deal, and cutting him would probably be cost prohibitive. But like, why would you want to do this with another year if a whole nother regime comes in here?
I mean, look, the most logical and pragmatic way to do this would be to mutually agree with Rodgers for a clean break. We're going to go with a new regime. We're going to have a new head of football operations, a new GM, a new head coach, a new offensive coordinator. It didn't work. If you want to be traded somewhere, let's talk about it. If you want to keep playing, it didn't work for both sides. Like we tried it your way. We got your guys here. It just didn't happen. I think that is probably the best long-term thing that probably could happen. I don't think it's likely to happen. Now, that could change. Rodgers is a mercurial guy. He could get banged up. He can look at the world and decide to do something else. He could just get so frustrated and kind of be done with it. You really don't know. He's a very unpredictable guy, which makes this even more challenging. He very well may say, I'm not going out like this. We're going to do this one more year. We got Devontae here. I don't mind if we have a new coach and GM. He'll say he's not going to weigh in. He'll weigh in. You can make a counter argument that pitched the right way to a new GM and head coach, having Rodgers and the chance to be competitive in your first year before you get to do a full rebuild is enticing in some way. You could also argue that it makes it an unappealing job. But when you look at like the other options for guys like the Saints and the Cowboys, like all these things come with like major problems. The smart thing would be to kind of cut bait, right? Unless Rodgers is like electric down the stretch and is like, wow, he's going to be a top 12 quarterback next year. That seems unlikely to happen. I think he'll have enough moments though where, they're going to be transitioning owners. And whether it's Chris or whether he outsources the work to someone else, it's kind of like, oh, like at least we'll have a quarterback that people know. And he'll be like, okay. And like we'll have a starting quarterback. So we don't have him. Like, what are we doing? Like we're selling tickets with Jordan Travis for opening week. We're drafting a 3rd-round quarterback. We're getting Gardner Minshew. Unfortunately, things like that will weigh into the decision. And I think Rodgers can be like the 16th best quarterback in the league the rest of the way. And maybe next year, if he's healthy, 16th, 17th. And the problem is that's not good enough if you have a bottom 10 defense and like a mediocre offensive line and mediocre coaching. It's good enough if you have great defense and good coaching to kind of like work around it. It's good enough to be like 500, not like a Super Bowl contender. So we'll see. I mean, does he sit down for a couple of weeks and they look a little different or better with Tyrod? Does it not matter? I don't know. He's a very unpredictable guy. But yes, if all things were being equal and you brought in like a third party who was completely dispassionate about the situation, the recommendation would be don't do what started this whole drought, which was half measures. Go full clean slate. Gut the entire thing outside of the owners who you can't get rid of. And even in some ways, you're getting a bit of a fresh start somewhat with the ownership. And just this, you tried this Hail Mary because you missed on Zach Wilson. In some ways, it was your only option. And you tried it, it just failed. So like call it that it failed. Don't let it fail for 2 years. Let it fail or 3 years. Let it fail for only 2 years and move forward. I'm just not convinced that's going to happen because as Jet fans, we always think these things are very like finite and cut and dry. Like they got killed by the Cardinals. They're going to lose every game the rest of the year. Rodgers is going to get hurt and never want to play again. That's not how football works. Like I wouldn't be surprised if they beat the Colts next week. And then everyone's like, oh, then they have a bye week and they come out and they get destroyed by Seattle. And then like they beat Jacksonville and they get destroyed by the Rams and they kind of like muddle to 6-11 or 7-10 again. And Rodgers has some moments and everyone's like, well, look what he did against the Jaguars and the Dolphins. And he actually finished over the last 7 games with like a 65 completion percentage and 11 touchdowns and 2 picks. That's more likely to happen, even though it would probably be for the best if they lost every game the rest of the way. I understand wanting that to happen from like a long-term perspective, but just like they beat Houston, that doesn't usually happen that way. So that's my 2 cents on that overall situation.
And there's zero difference between that and what we said about Sam Darnold at the end of his rookie year. And there's zero difference between that and Zach Wilson's performance against the Buccaneers and Antonio Brown's last game. And like, it's just the same talk track over and over and over and over again. And at this point, like, I mean, I probably shouldn't say this out loud, but like Christopher Johnson hired Adam Gase. Like that doesn't make me feel good either. Like are either of the Suns ready to go? Like, let's get somebody else in here. Right. So like, it's just, it feels so bleak across the board. And yeah, I think a mutual parting ways would be nice. And it's frustrating for me to hear you say that, like, what are we going to go into like, how do you sell tickets, with Jordan Travis? Like, I think I am kind of working myself to the point of like the quarterback should be Jordan Travis next year. see what you have, take stock, throw him into the fire. If he's good, great. If he's not, now we're moving on and we're on to the next one. But like, don't worry about ticket sales for a year. The season ticket holders already hate you. So like, let's just figure out how to completely gut the thing out and trade every tradable piece that you possibly have and start over and start fresh.
Yeah, it's a shitty situation. Let's rip through some of these questions, and again, we're going to save some for later in the week. How does this team, this is from Grubs18, how does this team draft 4 running backs in the last 3 drafts, sign Cook, and then never run the ball? No identity at all from the GM or the coaching staff. It's dysfunction from the president all the way down. I think I'm zeroing it out from the running perspective. Like, look how the Cardinals have built its identity running the football. The Jets could have done that on the first drive. Give Brees the ball in the red zone over and over and over again. We talked about this a lot in the offseason where you have Brees, you have Braylon Allen, you have Isaiah Davis, you have this offensive line. Protect Rodgers, run the ball like crazy. And if that ends up being your identity, like, go for it. They have no identity. And they haven't really had an identity since the Rex years. That was a clear identity. There was moments they had it in 22 with their defense and like sort of the young core, but there is no identity with this team. It's just sort of like mopey cerebral Rodgers throwing quick outs out the line and then periodically like mixing in some Brees carries. Then this one from Farmer 22. No other team looks as unprepared as the Jets week in and week out. This is 100% on coaching. They look like their focus is elsewhere. Is a complete overhaul the only move? Bringing Rodgers back seems like we'll be in the same place. We kind of just addressed this. And yes, I've been poking a lot today on Twitter on like the front office and ownership and Joe Douglas, but their coaching is horrific. They're not prepared to play. On the defensive side of the ball, clearly Ulbrich is overwhelmed trying to do both jobs. I don't know what their defensive game plan was. And I don't know if that like tackle thing was like him knowing what was about to happen and being like, we can't stop these guys. Not with this team, like not how we're playing this year. And he tried to like throw something out there to show that he was at least thinking about it, because this team just doesn't have the want. They don't want to tackle. They don't want to mix it up. They don't. That's not who this group is. And when Mosley's out, and again, Mosley's probably done here and he's had a good run, but when he's out, you kind of look at the guys that are running around and some of the linebackers that are rotating in, the D linemen, and it's like, this team just isn't actually that good, especially if Sauce is not like an elite player. Like Quinnen has his moments, but it's just like they're not actually that good anymore. And I just think you see that trickle through.
Yeah, I mean, I have the post game up on mute behind my computer right now, and Sauce is talking right now, and whatever's happening, I can't hear it, but it doesn't look good. It looks like he's being defensive and probably saying the wrong thing. And to your point, it's so frustrating that like the want to element that you're talking about is completely not there, and the excuse making that is paired with the lack of want to makes it unlikable. Like that's the formula that adds together to make this team unlikable, is like you don't have the want to and you can't own your own mistakes, and it's really pathetic. And as far as the identity question, the Jets talk all the time about who they are not. They never talk about who they are because they have no idea who they are. They're quick to tell you we are not this team that's getting blown out 31-6 by the Cardinals, but who are you? You don't have a real answer to that question. And everything, I agree with you, everything we said in the offseason was, you know, you've been leaning so heavy on Brees the last couple of years because you had to, because you had no quarterback. And now with at least the threat of a quarterback, you would think that the offense would completely run through Brees Hall, and it just hasn't. They haven't gotten it going.
Yeah, I'm looking at some of the quotes and, you know, from Sauce now too, and Rodgers just seems like a dude who doesn't have answers, and Sauce seems like a guy who doesn't want to be pressed on anything. I know I missed one. I got to make that tackle, but does not seem upset in the slightest. And look, I don't want to get in these dudes' head. I'm sure he is actually upset. I'm sure he wants to play well. I'm sure he wants to get paid well. Like, I'm sure this guy has pride, and I don't want to just pick on him because a lot of people suck today. And I do still think he will be a good NFL player, a really good NFL player. But this year has just been such a kick in the balls with how he's played. And it's like, you know what? Like, throw Stiggers out there, throw Eccles out there, throw anyone out there. And you get like at least a guy like Jalen Mills, who was like trying and flying around a little bit. This current iteration, man, like it's just something's rotten with this team this season. And I don't know how deep the rot is, where like I don't talk about trading Sauce lightly. Connor doesn't talk about trading Sauce lightly. Like, we are not generally reactionary with this stuff. But it's like actually something you really have to consider because it's such a mess, and you have to do a couple extreme things to get assets to, and you can't pay everybody. And you just look at what you've gotten from Garrett and Brees and what you had previously gotten from Jermaine, and you're like, what kind of team do we want to be going forward? What kind of identity do we want to be going forward? What positions do we want to invest in going forward? And I, I think you, in many ways, you're going to have to go. You're going to have to clean as much as you can. It's never as full clean out as you expect it to be, but you got to get as much of this current regime out of there. I mean, the Jets have 2 interceptions this season, 2 interceptions in 10 games. They're both by Brandon Eccles, who's a part-time player. They had 1 sack today. They don't force turnovers at all. They don't knock the football out. And they didn't score a touchdown today. Like, that is like, with this offense and with these weapons, it's just disappointing. And they deserve all the heat and all the shit that they're going to get. And it's going to be, there's going to be nobody there. And I'm glad they got flexed out of prime time. And look, people should go if they have their tickets and want to hang out and tailgate, and hopefully it's nice weather. But it's a sad ass game. 1:00, Rodgers, Flacco, 3-7 Jets, 4-6 or whatever the Colts are. And that's what a lot of their remaining games are going to be when they're playing Jacksonville, when they're playing this hobbled Miami team. And I just, you hope that, can you see something from Olu? Can you see something from Corley? Can Allen finish strong? Can Davis make a couple plays? Can Stiggers play a little bit? Can McDonald finish with 12 or 13 sacks? Do you just play all the undrafted defensive linemen and maybe a couple breakthrough? Do we get some Tyrod to let him run around and have the Jets at least be entertaining? Because, you know, Rodgers' shtick when you're losing and you suck, like, people really have no patience for it. Like, you can put up with it, like, if you're winning and he's playing well, that's like the trade-off you make with being a sports fan. But I'm smarter than everybody, I know better than everybody, when you're literally throwing repeated 1-yard out routes, like, it's hard. It's hard to watch, man. So I don't know. I don't know what comes next. I think we're going to just rant a little bit for most of this week. I think we'll see what happens with these remaining games. Do we see a different quarterback? How do they even bother to show up in home games versus away games? It's unpredictable. It was not unpredictable that they would lose today, right? I think basically all of us thought they were going to lose today. I didn't really hear anyone in our chat or our feed or our Discord be like, oh, they're going to win today. I think most people thought they were going to lose. I think most people are going to expect them to lay and die against the Colts, and they might win an ugly game that still gives people some false hope that there's something there going into the bye week. I think the point is that I'm not really sure it matters either way. Like, maybe if they lose 20-3 to the Colts or they beat the Colts 17-16, it shouldn't really change your longer term thinking when you could still have games like you had today. So whether they finish 7-10 or whether they finish 4-13, you have to take a hard look at things like today and be like, this iteration is never winning anything of consequence. Joe Douglas is going to be given 100 games. He's done. He's one of the all-time historic NFL front office failures by every statistic and every measure. He's literally made history with how bad he's been in 100 games from a record standpoint. Ulbrich, he's not going to be a head coach in the NFL. And maybe that's not fair, but he's just not going to be. Downing is not going to be an offensive coordinator somewhere in the NFL next year. He's just not going to be, even though he hasn't been that bad. And most of these other guys, like, as I said, like Clemens, Tony Adams, these guys are not NFL starters, and they're not going to start anywhere else if they're not starting here. So it sucks when you have an unlikable team. We could deal with bad teams. Unlikable teams are a different level of it. And look, we're already in pre-production on the autopsy on everything that's wrong with this era and really everything that was going on. And I look forward to that to an extent because that's what we do here. But, you know, there's 7 games left. And, like, could we see some touchdowns? Could we have some fun? Could we get a little bit that's why people gravitate towards, like, Garrett, because there's a joy that he plays a game with. And it seems that people migrate towards that. You don't see that from Rodgers. You don't see that from Sauce. You don't see that from Devontae Adams. They're like, it's just something missing, man. And maybe it looks different for a week, but then it probably regresses to the mean. But we could have recorded this podcast 5 minutes into the first quarter. Like, we knew that. I was thinking of texting you and be like, let's just record at like 6 o'clock today because we knew where this was going. And well, look, we're going to get into it all week. And I think fans, like, keep hammering us with questions. Keep getting it out. And that's why we have Discord. It's why we have Patreon. It's why we have the YouTube. It's why we have all this stuff. But they just disgrace today. Absolute disgrace. And don't let anyone tell you otherwise.
Yeah, I'll leave you with this. After 10 games last year, they were 4-6. Zach Wilson got benched, and they went to Tim Boyle for the home game on Black Friday against Miami. And that's when things really, really bottomed out for the Jets. I think, when they benched Wilson, there was still conversation of whether or not benching Wilson was the right move because they were in the mix. And right, wrong, or indifferent, as bad as Zach Wilson was, he was the one that had you in the mix. After 10 games this year, we're a game worse. We're 3-7. And in both years, last year and this year, we have a home game coming up after 10 games. And I don't know if you could find a Jets fan out there who could tell you that they're going to go to this home game against the Colts next week feeling any better than they felt last year going to a home game against the Dolphins after 10 games with Tim Boyle starting, the entire offensive line hurt, Garrett Wilson not really, involved, and all the things that went wrong last year. Like, I don't know if you could find a fan who says they feel better this year about that. And I think that's a really damning indictment of everything that's going on with this organization and all the things we talk about that have led to this point, that you brought in Aaron Rodgers and you're actually worse off this year than you were last year with potentially one of the biggest busts in NFL history.
Yeah, I think that's a really good summary and a good look to where things were last year. And I went to that Black Friday Boyle game in the rain, or not the Black Friday game, the Falcons game.
Yeah, you went to the Atlanta game the next week.
I won't be going to a late season game this year. This is my own personal choice, but yeah, I'm not going to give you a bunch of BS silver linings right now. I think they should get rid of the GM. I think they need a head of football operations. I think they need to rebuild the entire football infrastructure. I think there's some parts of the roster that are worth keeping and not cutting bait on. I think it's not quite as dire in some areas as it seems in a game like today, but it's a full rebuild. And again, this was always a Hail Mary with Rodgers, and they completed the Hail Mary getting him here. They didn't have really other options. It was him or Derek Carr, and the Derek Carr thing would have been even worse, I think, in many ways. But when you miss the way you did with that second pick, you tried a desperate move. And desperate moves, it was a flip of a coin, if not even worse than that. There's probably a 40% chance of it working out. I think the whole thing ended when he got hurt in the first game, to be honest. I think that really jarred his age, the timelines, the expectations, the patience. When we look back on this and why it didn't work, or we will say, could it have worked if he didn't get hurt in that first year? Maybe it's a different story. I think that's what we go back to and say, if this was going to happen, they couldn't have that first year be a mulligan, because that threw the whole thing off. And then hoping you could catch lightning in a bottle was always a little bit of a pipe dream. And they probably should be like 5-5 right now with an okay kicker, but it would have been a weak 5-5 and a 5-5 where the bottom would have fell out at some point, probably like in late December, like it did in 2022, where they closed the year with a 3 or 4 game losing streak. There would have been a little more fake hope right now. And we're not even going to get that at this point. Although again, this is going to be so frustrating to watch the 8 and 9 Broncos be the 7th seed while the Jets finish 6 and 11, and keep that playoff drought going. So thank you everyone for listening. There'll be another guys in the feed tomorrow with Jake and Paul. Connor and I are going to record Tuesday. We're going to have a long pod Tuesday with the two of us, and a long War Room Wednesday morning with the two of us. And then we will be back with Flight Plan, Buck the Trend, TOJ Talks, some Tankathon talk maybe, and of course the Jets Colts preview. So thank you everyone for listening, and we will talk to you soon.